Hello and welcome back. Amazon Route 53 provides a number of services, and one of those services is it's a domain name system server, a DNS server. Now that's its primary function, and it has lots of intelligence around that and then some supporting services that provide a good feature set. Now let's just have a quick recap on DNS. So remember, we covered it earlier in the course, and DNS is essentially the service that is used to resolve a domain name to an IP address. So if this user connects to a domain name like mycompany.local, but that could be a public name as well, like amazon.com. The user enters the address in the browser. The computer then needs to get the IP address for the server. So it goes to a DNS server, which has a zone file which contains those records. It provides a response to the computer, telling it what IP address it needs, and then the computer can connect to the web server. So that is what Amazon Route 53 does. Same process, we have something that we call a hosted zone, and the hosted zone contains the records that relate to a specific domain. So the user now connects to Route 53, tries to look up a domain name, it comes back with a response, and then the user can connect to the web server, in this case using an HTTP GET request. So that's DNS, much like many other domain name system servers. But what is it that Route 53 does that's special? Well, it has these routing policies. So this is some intelligence that's built into Route 53. The routing policies are there to determine which records to return to a client that's trying to resolve a domain address. So we can do things like we can fail over between resources in different regions. We can get users to connect to the closest service to where they are geographically. So those are a couple of options. Now we'll go through each of these with a bit of a diagram to help you understand what these different routing policies actually do. The first one is the simple routing policy. Not too intelligent, just does a basic function. You can have a record, and that record can have multiple values. When a user then tries to query Route 53, Route 53 will return a response, and it can be one of these records, and it will just go through them in a round robin fashion if there's multiple records in an individual record set. The user then gets the response and can use that to connect to whatever service they're connecting to. So that's the simple routing policy. We then have the weighted routing policy. Here what we do is we define multiple record sets, each that points to a different endpoint, and we can specify a relative weight for that particular endpoint. So now when a query goes to Route 53, what it will do is 60% of the time it's going to return one result, 20% another, and 20% another. So that's defined by the weightings. Now I've simplified this a little bit. In reality, it uses an integer between 0 and 255. But the point is, you specify the values so that you can weight the responses to wherever you want the most traffic to go. And then, you might be doing something like testing another website or directing a certain portion to a different region. You can optionally enable health checks as well, which means Route 53 will check that the endpoint is healthy, and if it's not healthy, it won't return that endpoint as a result. Next, we have the latency routing policy. Here, again, we define multiple records, and then we have a value, and we specify the region where we want people to be directed to. So what this means is when a user is in a specific region, they'll go directed to the closest endpoint to them. So let's say we've got AP Southeast 1, AP Southeast 2, and US East 1. If we have somebody doing a DNS query in Singapore, they'll get directed to AP Southeast 1 because that's the closest endpoint to where they are, the lowest latency. If they're in Sydney, they might go to AP Southeast 2, and if they're in New York, they'll go to US East 1. Again, you can optionally enable health checks for any of these endpoints. We then have a failover routing policy. So here what we're doing is we have a primary active website, and then we might be failing over to a secondary website if the primary fails. So we have two record sets, and each of them has a corresponding value. Now the value can be an IP address, or it can be a load balancer. One of them is specified as primary, and the other as secondary. So we've got Route 53, we've got a region here, US East 1 and AP Southeast 2. And Southeast 2 is the secondary region. We can see that in the record set here. So now the response to a query is going to go to US East 1. The querier will get a record from Route 53 saying that they should go to US East 1. In this case, a health check is required. So you must have a health check configured because the health check is making sure that that endpoint is actually healthy. Now, if that instance fails, the next time a computer queries DNS, it's going to get a different result. It's going to go to the secondary record instead. So that's failover routing. We've then got geolocation-based routing. So here again we have multiple record sets with different values, IPs or load balancer IDs, and we specify a region. And what we're doing here is we're pinning the records to a specific region. So we're saying if you come from one of these locations, this is where you should go. So it's not using latency information, we're specifying it, we're kind of hard coding it into our configuration. So in this case we might have multiple regions. If someone's in Mexico, we can define that they will go to US East 1. Here that's the default. So it means anyone who's not in Oceania or in Singapore is going to go to the default, and that's being specified as US East 1. But if you're in New Zealand, then that would be Oceania. So in that case, the record that gets returned is the ALB ID. Again, you can have health checks and they are optional. A multi-value routing policy is where we have multiple values that are returned to the querier. And that means that they can use any of those records to connect to the endpoint. So again, they query Route 53 and it sends multiple values in the response. It's kind of like load balancing, but a very simplistic version of load balancing. And again, you can have health checks and they return the healthy records only. So that's a quick overview of Route 53. What we'll do in the next lesson is we're going to do some hands-on and actually put some of these into practice and test out a couple of routing policies.